What does this amazing airplane, this unique airplane, and this beautiful airplane all have in common? We're going to tell you in a special episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Machat. What these three airplanes have in common is they all represent British aviation firsts. And I'm starting with the Comet 4, and I'm showing you this photo because it's very personal to me. This is the first jet airliner that I ever saw. On approach to New York's Idlewild Airport in 1958. We'll tell you that story in a little more detail in a moment. But the first British airliner I ever saw was the Britannia. So, of course, I had to build a frog model of that beautiful airplane. And as a kid, I rode away to a lot of different companies. I rode to Vickers in England and received a beautiful set of postcards, which I still have and treasure to this day. So let's dive in. We're going to begin at the jet age. Before we do, I want to just issue a quick apology if I leave out any airplanes or have nomenclature that isn't quite correct. This is an overview. We're going to just take a brief look at a lot of different airplanes. I want to get everything in. So let's begin. This is the Gloucester E-2839, first flown in 1941. And yes, I'm aware there were jet engine developments in Germany, in Italy, and in England all about this same time. But I want to pay tribute to this gentleman, Sir Frank Whittle, considered father of the English jet engine. First flown in the Gloucester that you see there, and flown in the United States in the Bell XP-59. A version of that engine was built under license by General Electric. The de Havilland DH-108 Swallow was Great Britain's first swept-wing airplane, first tailless airplane. And the DH-108 was built to probe supersonic flight at a time when experimental jet aviation was in its earliest and most dangerous phase. Flown by test pilot John Derry, the DH-108 became the first European aircraft to achieve Mach 1 in a dive in September 1948. And it was the world's first supersonic aircraft to take off and land under its own power. Sadly, during the late 1940s, all three DH-108s were lost in fatal accidents, proving that exploring the unknown frontiers of aviation came at a very high price in that era. But aircraft like the DH-108 played an important role in the impressive advances we have in aviation today. Here's the world's first jet flying boat, the first Delta Wing bomber, one of the great V bombers, the Avro Vulcan, in 1952. And this is a personal favorite. I had an airline pilot friend who described futuristic airplanes as looking like they were flying 600 miles an hour just parked on the ramp. And this is a good example. What a beautiful airplane. In 1956, this airplane became the first aircraft to fly 1,000 miles per hour in level flight, setting a new world record in March of that year. The Fairey Rotodyne, a composite helicopter airplane intended for point-to-point, city-to-city transportation. It was even ordered by New York Airways and went through a number of very successful tests, but never entered production. So let's take a look at British airliners. How many were there? Well, quite a few. But this machine was pivotal. In 1942, a special committee was formed under the leadership of Lord Brabazon to assess post-World War II commercial aviation programs in Great Britain. In 1943, the Brabazon Report was issued, which formulated a forward-thinking plan for 5 new types of airliners. The Type 1, which you see here, was to be a large piston-powered transatlantic luxury liner, while the Type 4 was a small turbojet-powered mail plane that eventually became the de Havilland Comet. Pretty futuristic in 1943. The Brabazon flew in 1949. Let's take a look at some of the specs. It was 177 feet long, had a massive 230-foot wingspan, 5,500-mile range, and weighed nearly 300,000 pounds at takeoff. Well, believe it or not, those specs almost match a Boeing 767-300 today. But like so many airplanes in aviation history, it was too much too soon. The commercial passenger market would not support an airplane this large in the late 1940s, and so it never went into production, but still a very interesting breakthrough machine for its time. In 1951, a Douglas Dakota, the English DC-3, was fitted with twin Rolls-Royce darts as an experiment, and this airplane did serve in scheduled service for mail and freight. But 3 years earlier, the Vickers Viscount 700 series took to the air and became the world's first turboprop airliner with 4 Rolls-Royce Dart engines. In 1949, the de Havilland DH-106 Comet came to be, the world's first jet airliner. It carried 36 passengers, had a 490 mile per hour cruise speed. Here's the cockpit of the airplane, quite futuristic. First flight was July 27th, 1949. The Comet entered service in May of 1952, and it is well known that there were a series of accidents resulting from metal fatigue, where the British industry learned about aircraft that were flying at 35,000 feet for the first time, and the multiple cycles created a situation with metal fatigue, and the airplanes were grounded in April of 1954. But in that 2-year period, BOAC had the world's first jet airline network, and that's British Overseas Airways Corporation. 2 other airplanes in 1952, the Saunders Roe SR-45 Princess, a double-deck, massive 10-engined flying boat, the largest passenger flying boat ever built, and the beautiful Bristol Britannia, the Whispering Giant, first took flight in 1952 as well. In 1954, the improved Comet 3 took to the air, and this was the gateway to a very successful airplane that had a long service life. In 1957, we saw the 800 series of the Vickers Viscount, seen here in Continental Airlines markings for U.S. service. Beautiful airplane. 2 other British airplanes to mention, the Handley Page Herald and the Vickers Vanguard. But this brings us back to the Comet 4, which entered service in 1958. And I want to tell you an interesting story. This is the interior of the Comet, and yeah, dig those crazy socks. But here's a beautiful shot of the airplane over London. And this is the machine that established the world's first passenger jet airliner service across the Atlantic. It landed at New York's Idlewild Airport and really made history, beating Pan Am's 707 by 2 weeks, although Pan Am had a 707 at the adjacent gate just to show the world the first 2 jet airliners. The date was Saturday, October 4th, 1958. And my father loaded our family into the Studebaker, and he said, "Get in, we're going to the airport." And he wouldn't tell us why. He said it's a surprise. And what awaited us when we got to that observation deck were the world's first 2 jet airliners. And I have to tell you, it was like seeing 2 spaceships that had just landed from Mars. The white arrow shows just about where we were on the observation deck. My dad was a professional photographer and took the shot of the Pan Am 707. My mom had a Kodak Brownie and took a shot of the Comet, so apologies for the low res. But we were witnessing aviation history and literally the beginning of the jet age. This compelling photo shows the transition from props to jets. As mentioned, the Comet went on to a long service life with any number of different airlines around the world, and also evolved into the world's first jet-powered maritime patrol and anti-submarine aircraft, the Nimrod series. De Havilland's next airliner was the Trident, the world's first 3-engine jet airliner. There were 3 versions. The Trident II is pictured above. It first flew in 1962, and in 1965, a Trident made the first Category 3 blind landing in actual airline service. The first jet airliner to have engines in the rear was the French Caravelle, but the first rear twin jet with a T-tail was the British Aircraft Corporation BAC-111 in 1963. The first airplane with 4 engines mounted in the tail was the Vickers VC-10, first flown in 1962, and the Super VC-10 Stretch that you see here in 1964. This airplane was beloved by passengers and crews alike and had an amazing 6,000-mile range. Here it is at New York's JFK in 1965, the most elegant airplane on the airport, bar none. Wait a minute, this ramp looks familiar. Could it be? Yes, it's the same spot as the Comet's first arrival in 1958. And by the way, that rooftop that you see in the foreground is the same roof that was home to hundreds, if not thousands, of screaming girls in 1964 and 1965 when these guys arrived in New York. About that same time in France, there was the Super Caravelle study for a supersonic airliner, and in Great Britain was a similar study, and these two efforts were joined to create what was known as Concorde, which made its first flight on March 2nd, 1969. Just a stunning airplane, capable of speeds at Mach 2.04 at 60,000 feet. I had the privilege of flying on the Concorde 3 times, each one just more memorable than the next. But really futuristic airplane, again, which first flew in 1969. These are the delivery markings for the British Airways airplane. This is the scene as the jet made its world tour and landed in Los Angeles in 1974. But these markings gave way to two more modern iterations, and the airplane was flown in service from 1976 to 2003. Quick shout out to the BAE 146, great little airplane. Had a couple of flights on this, and it was a nice machine for the regional airlines seen here in US markings. Great little airplane. Now we come to the angled deck on an aircraft carrier. And I want to pay tribute to this gentleman because no mention of British aviation would be complete without this brilliant pilot, the legendary Captain Eric Winkle Brown, who made more carrier landings than any other pilot in history and flew a staggering total of 487 different types of aircraft. Again, the most of any pilot in history. He made the first landing of a jet on an aircraft carrier, flying a de Havilland Vampire aboard the Royal Navy carrier HMS Ocean in December 1945, 1 year before a McDonnell Phantom jet first did that in the US. After a stellar lifelong career in aviation, Brown passed away in 2016 at the age of 97. During the late 1940s, new high-speed jet aircraft were operating from World War II-era straight-deck aircraft carriers, posing serious problems if jets missed the arresting wires or had to go around. Launching these aircraft was also a challenge from the shorter foredecks. To solve this problem, Royal Navy Captain Dennis Campbell developed the idea of painting shipboard deck guidelines canted 10 degrees to the port side on the HMS Triumph, allowing landing jets more distance to land at safer, higher speeds and bypassing parked aircraft on the foredeck in the event of a go-around. An interesting innovation, as well as steam catapults and the mirror landing system. The ski jump deck, also a British innovation, seen here on the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers in use today. Ejection seats. The Martin Baker Aircraft Company, formed in 1934 by Captains James Martin and Valentine Baker, created innovative fighter prototypes like the sleek MB-5, which first flew in 1944. Sadly, when Baker was killed in a crash, Martin decided to devote his entire career to pilot safety and survivability in high-performance aircraft. In this photo, now Sir James Martin, wearing his trademark hat, beams with pride after a successful ejection seat test. Beginning with a Bolton Paul Defiant and then a Gloucester Meteor jet, early testing led to the design of ejection seats that soon established Martin Baker as an industry leader. And because of these seats' superior performance at low altitude, the US Navy took notice, acquiring Martin Baker seats for their new carrier-based jet aircraft, which use Martin Baker seats to this day. There can be no better example of this as an incident with a Vought F-8U Crusader on October 21st, 1961, aboard the U.S. Navy carrier Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Caribbean Sea. The jet from Squadron VF-11, the Red Rippers, was piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Terry Cryway. With a heavy sea state and pitching carrier deck, the F-8 hit hard, shearing the right main landing gear and rupturing the main fuel line. The scraping magnesium landing strut pulled the plane's nose to the right, ripping out the tailhook as the engine flamed out and jet fuel ignited. Kind of a bad day. Lieutenant Cryway had less than 3 seconds to realize what was happening and eject from the crippled craft. You can see him here reaching for the handles. Look at this sequence. Canopy coming off, seat coming out of the airplane, clearing the tail, the seat man separation starting to happen with the drogue chute, and the chute unfurling. Believe it or not, Cryway survived with only a small laceration on his neck from a harness. The ejection was significant because there was a Navy film crew stationed on the carrier's island that day, and this photo sequence clearly proved that the Martin Baker Mark V seat was fully capable of saving pilots in an off-the-deck ejection. Quite understandably, Martin Baker used this photo in all their ads that year. Another compelling ad photo was this stunning shot of an English Electric Lightning seconds away from impact on a farm, with its pilot ejecting at the last possible moment. Like the previous incident, this pilot survived without major injury as well. Recently, a successful demonstration of the advanced Martin Baker Mark XVI ejection seat was witnessed at the Lockheed Martin plant in Fort Worth, Texas, when a brand new F-35B Lightning II crashed on landing during a pre-delivery test flight. This textbook 00 ejection occurred on December 15th, 2022. Vertical flight. During the mid-1950s, 3 radical new U.S. aircraft were flown and tested, and they were called tail-sitters for their vertical orientation on the ground. The biggest attribute of these machines, known as VTOL for vertical takeoff and landing, was the discovery of insurmountable problems with this concept, all in the name of eliminating the need for long runways or operating from the decks of ships. Something different was needed. The answer? An airplane that would take off and land horizontally and then achieve vertical flight. This was known as VSTOL, or vertical or short takeoff and landing. In 1957 in England, Bristol Engines Director of Technology, Dr. Stanley Hooker, utilized earlier French technology and devised a combination of the Bristol Orpheus turbojet engine hot section, as used in the Folan Gnat, with the larger compressors of the Bristol Olympus, used in the Avro Vulcan, to create the Bristol Siddeley Pegasus vectored thrust turbofan engine. This new power plant produced an impressive 15,000 pounds of static thrust, and when coupled with 4 rotating louvers, became the lift system for the radical Hawker-Siddeley P1127 prototype, which first flew on October 21st, 1960. Successful testing of the more advanced Kestrel prototypes led to development of the operational Harrier and Sea Harrier close support fighters. Sea Harriers saw action during the Falkland Islands campaign in 1982, becoming the world's first combat-proven VSTOL jet aircraft. Additionally, the U.S. Marine Corps used 2 versions of the Harrier, built under license by McDonnell Douglas. So from the first jet airliner to the largest jet airliner, from early ejection seat technology to today's really impressive 00 capability, from slanted deck, angled deck carriers to the norm for every carrier in operation today, and from vertical flight, the Kestrel, Harrier, and now the Lightning II. And of course, the world's only successful sustained service supersonic airliner, the magnificent Concorde. These are all examples of British aviation firsts. And there you have it, a look at significant technology from across the pond, as we like to say here in the US, And a salute to the great British industry and all my friends in the UK. I hope you enjoyed this. Special thanks to Tony Butler for the use of his images and material. Great friend, great supporter. And these gentlemen who also allowed us to bring this presentation to you. So thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. Hope you enjoyed this episode. We have plenty more to come. If you haven't subscribed, we'd love having you on board, and please do hit the like button on the way out. It helps us with Facebook and YouTube. Until next time, take care.